The security guard said it simply, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Your fiancé reported the elevator alarm. He wouldn't leave until we found you. Ingrid Beckett had approximately 3 seconds to decide what to do with that information. She used 2 of them to register that the man beside her, the one in the worn work jacket with a Callahan Building Services patch stitched above the breast pocket, had gone completely still. She used the 3rd to wrap her fingers around his forearm. He never does, she said. Reid Callahan could diagnose a building the way some people read a room. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a skill built over 18 years of crawling through mechanical spaces, towers, and Brampton distribution centers, reading the signs that systems left behind when they were about to fail. A particular vibration in a fan coil that meant the bearings were going. A pressure differential that shouldn't be there. An elevator that paused half a second too long at the 4th floor, every single time until it didn't pause at all, until it stopped. His son, Eli, had started leaving notes on the kitchen counter when Reid worked early calls, not every morning. Just the ones where Eli woke before 6 and decided, in the way 9-year-olds decided things, that the day required a note. One of them said, "Good luck, don't fall in any walls." Reid had kept it folded in the side pocket of his tool bag. That particular morning, Eli had left a drawing instead of a note. A man in a hard hat standing beside something large and rectangular that Reid eventually identified as an elevator. He put it with the others and drove to the Beckett Tower before the city fully woke up. The call had come in at 5:47 a.m. elevator failure, Beckett Tower underground parkade level, routine enough. Reid had the mechanical systems contract for the building. He arrived, signed in, took the service stairwell to the parking level, and found the elevator sitting between the underground and lobby floors with its diagnostics throwing 3 separate fault codes that didn't entirely make sense together. He was 60% through the repair when he heard movement inside the car. Not stuck then, occupied. He knocked twice on the door panel, identified himself, and asked if the person inside was all right. A woman's voice came back. Precise, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't waver, and said she was fine but would appreciate moving the timeline along. He moved the timeline along. He had the car down to the parking level and the doors open in 8 minutes. What he found was a woman in a gray wool coat standing in the center of the car as though she had been waiting for this specific door to open rather than any door. Dark hair, a cut above her left brow where she'd apparently contacted the handrail when the car dropped. She was holding her phone in one hand, its screen dark, and she was looking past Reid into the parking level with the focused attention of someone who was not actually looking at the parking level at all. She was looking at the 2 men standing 20 feet away, both in Beckett Tower security uniforms. Reid had not called security. He had called the main desk when he arrived and signed in. That was all. He looked at the men. He looked at their ID badges. In the flat fluorescent light of a parking level at 6 in the morning, it was easy to see what most people would have missed. The photos on their badges were recent corporate quality headshots. The men wearing them were not the men in the photos. He was still processing this when the building's actual security supervisor arrived from the stairwell behind him. Kamal, a broad-shouldered man Reid had signed past at the desk 100 times, came forward with genuine relief on his face. "Mrs. Beckett, thank God. Your fiancé reported the alarm when the elevator didn't release. We've been trying to get a second team down here." Reid had not reported any alarm. He had a work order, he had a tool bag, he did not have a fiancé or anything resembling one. He opened his mouth. Ingrid Beckett's hand closed around his forearm, firmly, deliberately. "He worries," she said, and she said it to Kamal, and she did not look at Reid at all. "If you're finding this story for the first time, consider staying with it. There is more happening here than a misunderstanding in a parking garage. There almost always is." The 2 men with the wrong ID badges were detained by Kamal and his team. Reid stood in the parking level for 20 minutes, giving a statement he didn't entirely know how to give, because what he had noticed and what he understood were not yet the same thing. Ingrid stood nearby, speaking quietly with a building manager. When the statement was done and the crowd thinned, she crossed to him and said, "Thank you for not correcting him." "I was going to." "I know." "I didn't give you time." She said it without apology, which somehow made it feel more honest. "Can I buy you a coffee and explain why I asked you to lie to your company's own security supervisor?" "I didn't lie." "You allowed a lie to exist in your vicinity." Reid looked at her for a moment. "There's a Tim Hortons on Adelaide." She said she had an office on the 14th floor with better coffee. He said the 14th floor of a building where two men had just shown up with false ID wasn't where he'd choose to have a conversation, and she paused, reassessed, and said Adelaide was fine. Her name was Ingrid Beckett. He knew the name from the side of the building, from the corporate account that paid his service invoices, from the business section of the Star he sometimes read on his lunch break. He had not connected those things to a specific person until now. She had been CEO of Beckett Pharmaceuticals for 3 years, since her parents died within 14 months of each other. She had grown up in the company the way some children grew up in churches. Not by choice, not with full understanding, but so thoroughly that by the time she was old enough to question it, it had already become part of how she thought. Her cousin Stuart had been with the company through all of it. He was 48, charming in the careful way of someone who had spent decades learning to appear charming, and for the past 4 months he had been pushing a drug called Meridax toward board approval with a persistence that struck Ingrid as something beyond confidence. Not passion, not ambition. Disproportionate. The difference was subtle, but she had known Stuart her whole life, and she had learned to trust that particular distinction. The data added up correctly. That was what unsettled her. Numbers that arrived from somewhere she couldn't identify but landed clean. Last week she had found something she could actually name. A subcohort in the early safety data that didn't match the patient intake records in size or demographic profile. Someone had filled a gap with patients who weren't in the formal register. She had asked Stuart about it. He told her she was misreading the methodology. She read the methodology 3 more times. The morning the elevator stopped, she had been in a pre-board meeting at which Stuart had presented his timeline for Meridax approval. She had said she needed 30 more days. He had looked at her across the table with the expression of a man who had already decided the outcome and was waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. She told Reid all of this at a corner table on Adelaide Street at 7 in the morning, while the city came to life around them, because he had noticed things other people wouldn't have noticed, and because he had made a decision in that parking level that she had no right to ask of him. Reid listened without interrupting. He was the kind of person who listened all the way to the end before he said anything, which was rarer than it should have been. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What was Meridax called in its early trials?" She told him X4. He asked what year the early trials ran. She told him, approximately 5 years ago. Reid sat with that for 3 seconds. Then he said his wife's name, Reid Callahan. He said she had died 3 years ago from what the hospital classified as a serious adverse event following medication, a drug she'd enrolled in through a study she'd heard about at their community health center, at a free screening session she'd attended because they had a gap in her insurance coverage that month. He said the trial name on the consent form she signed had been MRX4. He said it all in the same flat, careful voice he used for everything. And Ingrid recognized that voice because she had been using a version of it herself for 3 years. The voice of someone who has carried something long enough to know its exact weight and has learned not to put it down in front of strangers. She didn't say she was sorry. She asked if he wanted to see the full sub-cohort records. He said yes. They needed somewhere to work that wasn't connected to the Beckett Tower network and wasn't either of their homes. Ingrid had a family cottage on a lake 2 hours north of the city, the kind of place that had been in the family so long the deed was in a name she'd had to look up. She had not been there since her mother was alive. She drove. Reid sat in the passenger seat and looked out at the November highway and did not fill the silence unnecessarily. He was thinking about Mara, about the specific Tuesday of it, the phone in his tool bag, the 4:30 callback, the way she had said "I'll tell you later" in the tone she used when she didn't want to worry him, and how he had heard that tone and decided not to push, because she would tell him when she was ready, because he had always respected that about her. He had spent 3 years deciding he should have pushed. At the cottage, he set his laptop beside hers on the kitchen table and started working through the sub-cohort data, with the same methodical attention he gave to fault codes. Ingrid worked beside him. They didn't talk much. Around 11 that night, he found Mara's patient number in the intake register. He knew it from her hospital records. He had read them enough times that the number had simply become part of him. She was listed as patient 0047 in a cohort of 31 people drawn from community health centers across the GTA. None of the 31 had been enrolled through the formal Meridax trial process. There was no ethics board approval for this cohort. There was a signature authorizing the sub-study, and the signature belonged to Stuart Beckett, in his capacity as then head of clinical development. Ingrid looked at the signature and was very still. "He reported directly to my father at the time," she said. "I was managing the European partnerships. I had no visibility into domestic development." She stopped. "That isn't an explanation. I'm just telling you where I was." "I know," Reid said. The silence after that was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. Reid sat with the specific weight of the thing he now knew, that the company whose name was on this data was the same company whose CEO was sitting across from him, asking for his help, and he did not try to resolve it, because some things don't resolve. You stay with them. Ingrid sat with it too. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She made tea and put a mug in front of him and went back to work. Eli called at 8:30 the next morning. He wasn't calling about anything specific. He said, "Dad, are you coming home for dinner? I made the grocery list." It was such a normal sentence. Reid held the phone and listened to Eli explain that they needed more of the orange juice he liked, not the kind with pulp, and that his friend wanted to come over on the weekend. And was that okay? Reid told him to eat with Aunt Daphne tonight, told him he loved him. Eli said he knew and asked if Reid could bring something back from wherever he was. Reid said he'd try. He called his Aunt Daphne next. She had been the one constant in the Callahan family for 30 years, the person who showed up without being asked and stayed without needing to be thanked. He gave her an address 40 minutes west of the city and told her to take Eli there that night and not tell anyone where they were going. Daphne asked one question. "Are you all right?" He said yes. She said okay, and he could hear in her voice that she was already reaching for her car keys. Stuart found them before morning, not through the cottage, through a contact at the building's security firm who had flagged Ingrid's visitor log. They were 40 minutes ahead of him when the alert came through on a back channel Agnes had set up. Agnes Chu had been Beckett Pharmaceutical's chief compliance officer for 19 years before she quietly resigned 14 months ago. Ingrid had assumed it was retirement. Agnes, when reached through a borrowed phone, said she had not retired. She had left because she had found something she couldn't report internally without it being buried, and she had spent 14 months building a parallel record, waiting for someone with authority to receive it. She had adverse event reports deleted from the active system, internal memos from Stuart's division, a paper trail connecting his signature to every reclassification. She asked them to meet her at a service entrance behind a hotel near Union Station. They went in as what they were supposed to look like. Reid walked beside Ingrid with the unhurried certainty of someone who belonged in any space he entered. She moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 20 years navigating rooms where people watched her. When they passed through the hotel's side corridor, she stepped closer without saying anything. He registered the shift. He noticed that her breathing had changed and her face had not. Agnes met them in a service corridor with a hard drive and a legal summary and the expression of someone who had been waiting to put something down for a very long time. They were 40 feet from her when the lights went out. Not a fuse, not a circuit, every fixture on that level simultaneously. Reid pulled Ingrid sideways behind a linen cart before he finished processing the decision. He could hear footsteps. Not hotel staff, not a single disoriented person. A coordinated pair moving with purpose. He dealt with the nearer one in the space behind the cart. Not cleanly, not without cost. He ended up with a phone that wasn't his. He looked at the screen in the dark. A message read, "She doesn't leave the building with the drive. Manage the contractor." He read it twice. He was the contractor. He had been inside someone else's plan the entire time without agreeing to it, and the plan had decided he was a problem to be managed. Agnes had already pulled back. She texted 2 minutes later from 3 floors up. "Safe, files intact. I'll find another way to transfer." Reid and Ingrid waited in a maintenance room off the service corridor until it was clear. She stopped performing composure somewhere in the second hour. She sat on a concrete floor with her back against a metal shelf. And she was just a person in an expensive coat sitting in the dark, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with being tired. She said that after her parents died, Stuart had been the one constant. She had trusted him the way you trusted the ground. Not because you thought about it, but because it had never let you down. And understanding now what he had done. 31 patients, 4 deaths, her parents' company used as cover for something they would never have sanctioned. It didn't feel like the discovering a criminal. It felt like losing her family a second time. Reid was quiet for a moment. Then he told her about Mara, not the medical facts of it, the specific Tuesday of it, the phone in his tool bag and the 4:30 callback and the way she had said, "I'll tell you later," and how he had heard that tone and let it go, because he had always respected the way she communicated, and he had spent 3 years deciding that respect was the same as negligence. Ingrid turned to look at him in the dark. She took her time. "You respected how she chose to protect you," she said, "and she was protecting you because she loved you. Neither of those things is the reason she died." She said it with the flat precision she used for everything, like correcting a measurement that had been misread for years. The person who ran unauthorized trials on community health center waiting rooms is responsible for what happened to Mara, not the man who answered the phone at 4:30. It was not a grand statement, it didn't fix anything, but something in the way she said it, plainly like a fact she had no reason to soften, reached the part of him that had never been able to hear it before. He breathed out slowly. They sat in the dark for a while after that. Not an uncomfortable silence. Stewart called an emergency board meeting for the following morning. He framed it as a governance concern, Ingrid's judgment, her fitness to lead through a critical approval period. He had been cultivating the board for 2 years, and he had the votes to suspend her authority pending review, which meant Meridax went to final approval under interim leadership, which meant Stewart. Reid told her not to go. The building was compromised. Walking into a boardroom full of people Stewart had spent 2 years managing was not a controlled environment. Ingrid asked if he wanted to leave because the arrangement was finished, or because he was afraid of what was forming between them. He didn't answer. His phone rang. It was Eli. "Dad, I have something. I've been keeping Mom's pill bottle in my drawer." Eli's voice was serious and straightforward in the way he got when he had decided something. "Because it smells like her, kind of, like her soap. But there's a number on the bottom, and Aunt Daphne says numbers on medicine bottles matter." Reid went completely still. "Can you read it to me?" Eli read the batch number from the small orange bottle he had kept in his drawer for 3 years, next to a photograph and a smooth gray stone from a beach in PEI, the MRX4 lot number. The same number Agnes had flagged in her compliance files as belonging to the unauthorized subcohort, the physical lot that had never been formally registered as clinical trial material. The number that connected Stewart's signature to the product that had reached 31 patients without ethics board approval. A pill bottle in a 9-year-old's drawer, kept because it smelled like his mother. That was the piece Agnes had said she was missing. Reid told Eli he'd be home, told him he loved him. Eli said he knew, then he said, "Dad, are you actually coming back or are you just saying it?" "I'm coming back." "Okay." A pause. Aunt Daphne made butter chicken. "You're going to miss it, but I saved you some." He went back to find Ingrid. She had her jacket on and her bag over her shoulder. "I'm not going into that boardroom without you," she said. He reached into his jacket pocket and stopped. His hand found something small folded with the particular precision only Eli applied to things he considered important. He'd found it when he'd grabbed the jacket off the hook 2 mornings ago at home. Half asleep, moving fast. He'd forgotten it was there. He opened it. A drawing, a man in a hard hat. A woman with long hair sketched in careful loops, a small figure between them holding both their hands. Reid stood in the hallway and looked at it for a long moment. He did not ask when Eli had drawn it. He folded it back on its crease and slipped it into his shirt pocket, closer in. "We go together," he said. "We go in with everything." The boardroom held 14 people. Agnes arrived 4 minutes after they did. She set her file on the table, and what it contained was 14 months of documentation. Suppressed adverse event reports, authorization memos in Stewart's handwriting, the ethics board gaps, the lot number that matched Eli's bottle, and a signed legal attestation from 3 of the MRX4 patients who had been located and were willing to speak. Reid connected his laptop to the room's display and showed the chain of authorization. Showed Mara's patient record reclassified and the original documentation underneath it showing the reclassification had no medical basis. A board member named Harriet Dang, who had chaired the company's ethics committee for 7 years before Stewart quietly moved her to a less operational role, leaned forward and identified the compliance gap as something she had flagged in an internal memo 4 years ago and never received a response to. She had the memo on her phone. Stewart, at the far end of the table, called for security. Security arrived and looked at him, looked at Harriet, looked at Agnes and her open file. The evidence had already been transmitted. Agnes had sent it to Health Canada's Enforcement Division, to a compliance attorney in Ottawa, and to a journalist at the Globe who had been filing access to information requests about Merodach's trial record for 6 months and receiving corporate non-answers the entire time. There was nothing to suppress. Stewart was escorted out of the building by the actual security team, the ones whose badges matched their faces. He said nothing. He had the expression of a man who had planned for every contingency except the one where all the contingencies ran out simultaneously. The formal process took months. Merodach was suspended. 31 patient files were reopened. 4 families were contacted. Ingrid wrote every letter personally and did not delegate the language of a single one. Reid Callahan's file was formally corrected on a Thursday morning in February. Reid received the notification by email, which was not the right medium for what it contained, but there wasn't a right medium. The correction was 3 sentences. The adverse event had been caused by an unauthorized research compound administered without ethics board oversight. The patient had not been non-compliant. The prior reclassification was rescinded in full. He read it twice at the kitchen table while Eli was at school. He put it in the drawer where he kept things he needed to keep. Eli's drawings were in there already. Ingrid gave a press statement that did not minimize what the company had done. She said the structure had allowed it, the hierarchy, the oversight gaps, the culture in which the wrong questions never reached the right people. She said restructuring that structure was her responsibility, not a communications exercise. She established an independent patient fund with external governance and named Agnes Chu as its director. She contracted 3 outside safety bodies to audit every system in active development. When a reporter asked about the maintenance technician who had been present throughout, she answered without hesitation. She said Reid Callahan was not her fiancé. She said he was the person who had kept an elevator from failing in 2 different ways on the same morning. Who had noticed what trained security teams had not noticed. Who had sat in a service corridor through the night with information that put him in genuine danger and never once used it to negotiate anything for himself. She said the company owed him something it couldn't calculate properly. She said she was going to try anyway. Reid went back to work. He dropped Eli at school on a Monday morning and listened to him talk the entire drive about his bioluminescence project, which had somehow expanded to include deep-sea pressure physics and submarines, which his teacher felt was off-topic but which Eli felt was entirely relevant. He drove to a job in Etobicoke and stood in the mechanical room of a mid-rise and did the work. He was turning a pressure gauge over in his hands, not fixing it, just holding it, when Ingrid's car pulled into the service lot. She was alone. She walked across the mechanical room with the same directness she brought to everything and set a folder on the equipment shelf beside him. Inside was the formal correction for Mara's file in a handwritten letter. 4 pages, her actual handwriting on plain paper. "I'm not here to ask you for anything," she said. "I'm not going to ask you to join the fund board or be part of any of the public process." She stopped. "You deserve to have what happened to Mara acknowledged in writing by the company that caused it. Not in a regulatory filing, from a person." Reid set the gauge down. He told her that when he'd been standing in that boardroom, running the math on whether the evidence was enough, he'd had a thought that had nothing to do with the math. A thought about something he hadn't said in the service corridor the night before, when he'd had the chance. And that if the math came out wrong, he wouldn't get to say it. He told her he had stayed through all of it, not because of the arrangement, not even entirely because of Mara, though he'd needed that piece too. He'd stayed because somewhere in those 2 days he had stopped thinking of Ingrid as someone he was helping and started thinking of her as someone he did not want to lose. He had not felt that way about anything in a long time, and he did not fully know what to do with it, but he was not going to pretend it wasn't there. He said it the way he said everything, level, no performance, straight off the surface of what was true. Ingrid was quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid?" she said. "Yes." "Do you want to try anyway?" He looked at her. "I'm still standing here." She picked up the folder. She held it for a moment. Then she put it down and she took his hand, not for any audience, not to maintain any role, and held on. 3 months later, Eli gave his school presentation on deep-sea bioluminescence and received a B+ with a note from his teacher that he had included too much submarine content relative to actual biology. He announced at dinner that this was an unfair assessment. Ingrid said submarines seemed biology adjacent to her. Esai considered this seriously and said that was exactly the argument he had made. and he felt vindicated. He had taken 2 weeks to fully form his opinion of her. He was not a child who could be hurried or managed. He watched and he thought and he reached his own conclusions on his own schedule. One evening, he came out of his room with a photograph, Mara on a beach in PEI, laughing at something off frame, and held it out. "Was she pretty?" he asked Ingrid. Ingrid looked at the photograph for a long moment. "Very," she said. "And your dad still thinks about her. You can tell sometimes." Eli looked at the photograph. Then he set it back on the shelf and went to get his jacket because they were going for ramen and he was hungry. He didn't say anything else about it. But after that evening, he stopped choosing the opposite side of the couch when Ingrid came by. He just sat wherever he sat. Kemal was on shift 6 months later when Reid came through the Beckett Tower lobby with Eli for the company's holiday event. He recognized them both before they reached the desk. "Still the maintenance guy," he said, grinning. Reid looked at Kemal. He looked at Ingrid, waiting at the elevator with her hand out. "Working on it," he said. Kemal laughed and waved them through. In the elevator on the way up, Eli said, "What was that about?" Reid said, "First time I was here, he thought I was someone I wasn't." Eli thought about this. "Are you now?" Reid looked at his son. He looked at Ingrid. He reached into his shirt pocket and touched the edge of a folded drawing. A man in a hard hat. A woman with careful loops of hair. A small figure between them holding on. "Getting there," he said. The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor. Reid stepped out, held the door, and waited for both of them to come through. The misunderstanding in a parking garage, "He worries he never leaves," had arrived a few months ahead of schedule. But it hadn't been wrong. It had just been early. Some things know what they are before the people living them do. Echoes of Memory is built on exactly those moments. If this one stayed with you, subscribe and pass it to someone who needs to hear that the right things don't always arrive on time, but they do arrive.